Chapter 4. Lieutenant Wolseley. Caroline had to hurry to keep up with Mama as they headed out. Caroline was glad that her bossy neighbor wasn't in sight. Mrs. Shaw had once told Caroline's mother that Papa spent much too much time with Caroline. "It's clear that Mr. Abbott adores his daughter," Mrs. Shaw had said, but do you think it's wise to let Caroline spend so much time at the shipyard? A daughter's place is in the home, learning cooking and needlework. "There are many girls twice her age who aren't as skilled at needlework," Mama had said crisply. At the time, Caroline had ignored Mrs. Shaw's comments. Today, she wasn't sure she'd be able to. The village seemed to crackle with worried excitement. Passers-by jostled Caroline as she and Mama made their way past homes and shops. A few warehouses stood nearer the water, filled with crates and barrels of goods, window glass, boots, china, teapots, books, chocolate. The roads leading from Sackett's Harbor to inland New York were narrow, rutted, and barely passable for much of the year. Almost all supplies came and went by ship. Caroline felt a painful little lurch in her chest as they came to the wooden sign painted with a graceful sloop that simply read, "Abbott's." An almost finished schooner towered over their heads on a slipway, a narrow log bed near the water's edge from which the finished ship would be launched. The skeleton of another ship was rising up on heavy wooden support posts. Ladders leaned against the hull, and scraps of wood littered the ground. No carpenters were in sight, though. No one bustled past, pushing a wheelbarrow or hauling lumber. No one shouted orders or pounded with his hammer or sang old songs. They found Mr. Tate and a dozen other workers in the carpentry shop. Each man had a special skill. Some men worked with wood, some filled the seams between planks with make ships watertight, some prepared the ropes that sailors used to handle the sails. The men fell silent as Mama and Caroline stepped into the shop. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," Mama said. "I can see that you've already heard the sorry news." Mr. Tate tugged the lock of hair that fell over his forehead, a sailor's traditional gesture of respect. "Forgive me if I spoke out of turn, Mrs. Abbott, but I felt the men should know." "Of course." Mama took a deep breath and squared her shoulders. "I don't know how long my husband will be away, and I don't know what the war will mean for our business." The men exchanged troubled glances. Then Hosea Barton, the sailmaker, stepped forward. His skin was as brown as mahogany, and Caroline had always loved to watch his strong, dark fingers working against the pale sailcloth. "Pardon me, ma'am," he said. "Are we out of work?" "No, you are not," Mama said firmly. Abbott's has promised to complete those two schooners outside, and we will not disappoint our customers. Mr. Tate, do you have everything you need to continue?" "Why, yes, ma'am." "Good. You are in charge until Mr. Abbott returns." Jed, the youngest woodworker, spoke up. "What happens if Mr. Abbott doesn't come back?" "Papa will be back." Caroline glared at Jed. The workshop went completely quiet. Jed flushed and looked at his shoes. For a moment the only sound was the noisy cries of gulls outside, fighting over fish scraps. Then Mama looked Jed in the eye. "Of course Mr. Abbott will return," she said, quietly but firmly. "Now you may all get back to work." The men began heading to the door. Samuel, the ropemaker's apprentice, paused to say, "Thank you, ma'am. We'll do Mr. Abbott proud." When the other men were gone, Mr. Tate shifted his weight uneasily from one foot to the other. "Mrs. Abbott," he began in a low voice, "I can manage the men, but there's the account books. I kept the books when Mr. Abbott and I began the business, Mama said. I can do so again. Mr. Tate looked surprised and then relieved. Yes, ma'am, he said. Mama took Caroline's hand. Come along, I need to look at Papa's business papers. When Caroline reached the doorway of Papa's empty office, her feet stopped moving. The air still smelled of a spicy blend of pipe tobacco. The design drawings he'd made for the two schooners were tacked up on the one wall. His favorite tankard sat on the desk. Caroline longed to blink and see Papa hard at work among his things, but he was not there. Finally, she followed Mama into the room. Mama touched a model of the first sloop Papa had ever built. Suddenly, Caroline felt Mama shudder as she gulped down a sob. For a moment, Caroline wanted to cry, too. Instead, she slipped her hand into her mother's. You can keep the business going, Mama. I know you can. And I can help you. She wasn't sure how, but she was determined to try. Mama wiped her eyes and gave Caroline a watery smile. You know where Papa keeps the ledger? Yes, right here. Caroline opened the wooden box on the desk and pulled out a leather-bound book. Contracts for those two schooners are here, and he keeps bills in the drawer. Goodness, Mama said. How fortunate that you spent so much time helping your father. But I don't know anything important, Caroline said. Sometimes I copied a bill or letter for Papa, or I tidied up his office, or I read to the men as they worked. That's all. None of that would be of any help now. I'll sort it out, Mama assured her. She squinted at the lines of Papa's slanting script. I hope that. The door burst open. Caroline gave a little squeal of surprise as Lieutenant Wolseley himself stepped inside. He didn't look much older than Oliver, but he'd been stationed in Sackett's Harbor for several years, enforcing trade laws and capturing smugglers. He had curly hair swept back from his face and side whiskers that stretched along his jaw. His blue uniform coat glittered with gold lace and buttons and braid. Lieutenant Wolseley quickly pulled off his hat. Are you Mrs. Abbott? I am, Mama said. And this is my daughter, Caroline. Thank you for coming so quickly. Lieutenant Wolseley looked confused. For coming quickly? Aren't you here because of my husband? Well, yes, ma'am. I have some business to discuss with him. He tapped his leg impatiently. With the news that war has been declared, that business is quite urgent. Is he here? The British took him prisoner, Caroline burst out, and they stole our new sloop. The lieutenant's eyebrows rose in surprise. Mr. Abbott was sailing White Gull? I'd heard another name, Oliver Livingston. Oliver is my brother's son, Mama told him. He was to captain the sloop. My daughter was there as well. Caroline, perhaps you should tell Lieutenant Wolseley what happened. Caroline explained as quickly and as clearly as she could. So you see, sir, she concluded, we need you to get Papa and Oliver back, and the sloop too. Lieutenant Wolseley rubbed his chin with one knuckle. He did not reply. Caroline felt her heart grow heavier. Won't you help us, she asked. Can't you send Navy men to Kingston? He began turning his hat in his hands. It's not that simple. I have no idea where the British have taken your father and cousin Anne. My Uncle Aaron could probably find out, Caroline said. She saw Mama's small frown and knew it was because she'd interrupted, but the words kept pouring out. He and Aunt Martha and my cousin Lydia live in Upper Canada. If he can find out where the British are holding Papa and Oliver, will you go get them back, please? Lieutenant Wolseley sighed. I wish there was something I could do, but... My husband was captured before news of the war had even reached us, Mama said sharply. And you propose to do nothing? On the contrary, ma'am, I am doing all I can, he retorted. Now that war has been declared, keeping Lake Ontario safe for ships is of great importance to the United States. My first priority is to strengthen our defenses here against possible attack. I've already alerted our soldiers to be on guard. Caroline's eyes widened. The British might attack Sackett's Harbor? We need to build a fleet with all speed, the lieutenant was saying. I've heard that Mr. Abbott is quite skilled. He is, Caroline said fiercely. We're starting a Navy shipyard